Good morning, Year 7, and welcome to your next lesson on what does the Queen actually do. This is lesson 6. Before we start, please make sure you have got a pen and some paper to write on today. So pause the video here if you need it. Okay, so we should all have a pen and some paper to be getting on with this. As we go through, jot down your notes and make sure you submit them to your teacher at the end, please. So we're going to start off. Last lesson I set you to think about for the week the difference between Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II. So I want you to use the words surrounding these monarchs to tell me how they're similar and how they're different. And I want you to think about who is the better Elizabeth, who is the better queen, who has more power. Pause the video here for about 3 minutes and we'll have a conversation. Okay, so obviously these two Elizabeths are separated by a very long chunk of history. They're separated by 500 years or 400 years of history. In terms of land, both really control the same amount of land. Their accessions, both took the throne from their siblings previously. Elizabeth took it from her father. Elizabeth II took it from her father. Elizabeth I took it from her sister and her brother. They're both in control of large amounts of people. Their governments are very different. Obviously, the Queen Elizabeth is Queen Elizabeth II has to go to Parliament and they run the country, whereas Elizabeth I controlled herself, controlled the government herself. So there's lots of similarities, but there's also lots of differences. Queen Elizabeth I had more power to make decisions. Queen Elizabeth II plays a very different role as a monarch. Their legacies, obviously Elizabeth II is still alive, so we're not quite clear on what her legacy will be yet. But Elizabeth I's legacy is very significant, especially with all the things she changed about religion. But she also didn't, she wasn't succeeded by a son or a daughter, and the Tudor line ended with Elizabeth. So today we're going to look at a new person. We're going to look at Charles I. We're going to be looking at who they were, how they came to power, what he controlled, what powers he had, and how are they remembered. Charles I is a very famous monarch because he is the only monarch to be executed by his subjects, to have his head cut off. So I want you to just pause the video here for 1 minute and I want you to write down the reasons why this might have happened. So what is clear is that to execute someone, especially a king, they must have done something wrong and they must have not been popular. So we're going to be learning more about Charles I. Now before we start, we need to understand two key words, two key concepts. The first is divine right of kings and the second is republic. So I want you to pause the video here, I want you to go onto the internet and I want you to type these in and I want you to write a definition for each word, please. So do that and I'll see you again in 2 minutes. So, divine right of kings is the idea that the king is chosen by God to rule and any who deny his power go against God. So according to this, God, as we can see in this picture, puts the crown on the king's head. God chooses the king. Now, divine right of kings is important to kings because it gives them, it provides the reason why they should have so much power and others have so little. People who are very religious would follow the king, and because they believe that it's what God wanted. Now, a republic is different. A republic is a country where power is held by a group of people chosen by the public to represent them. So a republic is there is no king. The whole country is run by an individual. A bit like France today doesn't have a king, it's a republic. So if you haven't already done so, copy down those key words and I want you to think about why the divine right of kings was important to Charles. So pause the video here and come back to me when that's done. So the divine right of king is important to Charles because it gives justification for Charles being on the throne. People can't argue with him because arguing that he shouldn't be on the throne would be arguing against God. Let's have a look at how Charles came to power then. So I want you to just pause this video. I want you to go and watch video 1 in the description. I want you to make notes on how Charles comes to power and what he does with it. See you in a minute. Okay, so obviously he takes over from James II. Things, he's not the most popular of kings, but he uses his power to get rid of Parliament when he doesn't like them, and he wants to go to war. So just before we move on, I just want you to write down, how does Charles use his power? And he uses his power to try and get more power, to raise an army. And how does Parliament react? So Charles's relationship with Parliament is obviously not a good one. He dissolves Parliament a number of times. He goes against them. He actually rules without Parliament for a long time. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to watch video 2, and I'd like you to describe or make notes, on the positives and negatives of Charles's rule. I want you to look out for how many times Charles dissolves Parliament and why, and then how Parliament react to it. So go off, watch that video, and I'll see you again in about 4 minutes. So Charles then has an 11-year golden age. He refers to it as the golden age, where he builds new roads, he sets up the postal service, and he rules without Parliament. Parliament doesn't sit for 11 years. He only brings them back because he needs to raise taxes, and because they continue to go against him, he actually dissolves them 5 times. And he does that to show that he is in control and that they should be doing what he doesn't like. Every time they stand against him, he says, all right then, off you go, I don't need you anymore. And Parliament is getting more and more angry as we go through this, which isn't great. So we've said 11 years on his own. The golden years. However, he's criticised for spending too much money and being too extravagant. He tries to introduce the English prayer book in Scotland, and there are a large amount of riots. Parliament issues a list of complaints to Charles, but he ignores it. He actually orders the arrest of 5 MPs in 1642, and it's at this point where the MPs decide that Charles has now gone too far. So let's have a look at what happens next then. So the Parliament and Charles decide that they cannot work together. And what we have is a civil war between the parliamentarians and the royalists. The parliamentarians are the MPs and the royalists are the king. So the Parliament actually goes to war against the king to try and restrict his powers. Before we talk about this any further, I'd like you to pause the video and watch video 3 in the description, and I want you to make notes on the English Civil War. I want you to focus on why the war starts and then what the impact of that war is. I'll see you in about 5 minutes. Okay, so the battle, the wars between the two, there are victories on both sides. We have the Cavaliers versus the Roundheads. Parliament is trying to restrict armed forces, the church and English law. They're trying to stop Charles from having too much power. We have a first victory for Charles at Edge Hill. However, Oliver Cromwell then takes over the Roundheads and he wins the Battle of Naseby. This is the last big battle of the English Civil War. By 1647, Charles is captured and he's put on trial. So he has this huge trial, and it's the first time a king has actually had to defend himself for his beliefs and his power. Charles refused to reduce power, and Parliament ran out of patience. So Charles stuck to this divine right of kings. He didn't believe that he should be put on trial because he was chosen by God. And because he would not change his mind, because he would not, reduce his power, they actually executed him in 1649. And we see him, you can actually go and see where he was executed. It's at Horse Guards. It's about a 10-minute walk across St James's Park from the school. And they built a big plinth there and they executed him. he really didn't want to seem scared, so he actually put 2 shirts on to make sure he wasn't shivering for cold during the cold. He believed that, you know, he didn't want to be showing any fear when he went up and lost his life. So finally, you're kind of over to you now. You need to tell me why Charles I was so important. So we know that Charles came to the throne following the death of his father, King James. He believed strongly in the divine right of kings. He wanted to raise an army. However, that was challenged by Parliament, and he dissolved them. He went on an 11-year run without Parliament, and it was referred to as his golden years. But Parliament believed Charles was spending too much money. Charles actually gets rid of Parliament 5 times. He even goes as far as arresting 5 MPs. Parliament demands control of the armed forces, the Church of England, and the law. When Charles refuses, both sides go to war. We have the Cavaliers, the men loyal to Charles versus the Roundheads, the men loyal to Parliament. Charles is captured and executed. And then Parliament does not replace the king. Instead, they create a republic where they don't need a king, and Oliver Cromwell was installed as the Lord Protector. So, your task: write a paragraph on why you think Charles I was important. Use information from the above bullet points to help you. Remember that you need to write a point, example, explain, answer, a PEE paragraph. So I think Charles I was an important monarch for changing royalty in England, or changing power in England, for example. I know that, and you could talk about his, civil war, and it eventually led to his execution. This was important because Parliament did not replace the king. Instead, they created a republic. This was the first time an English king was executed and not replaced. So he's a very important king. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to spend 10 minutes on this answer. Remember, the best answer will have 2 paragraphs, and there could even be a however in there, a criticism, because he does do some positive things. He is important. So in 10 minutes time, I'll see you again. Alright boys, really well done for that paragraph, 2 paragraphs. Please make sure that you submit this to either myself, Miss Slater, or Mr. Drew. We're looking forward to seeing your responses. I just want to set you off with something to think about for next lesson. I want you to think about what replaced a king. All you need to do for this is to watch video 4 in the description. It's about 3 minutes long. And while you're watching it, I want you to think, is a Lord Protector different to a king? So what replaced the king is actually that different? Alright boys, thank you again for all your hard work today. Thank you for all your submissions so far today. I look forward to seeing some of your work. And have a great week. Alright. Thank you.